Welcome to another episode of The Hump with Katie. I'm your host, Katie Thiroux. I'm so thrilled to bring you today's episode with the world-renowned bow maker, Lynn Hannings, and also the world-renowned bass maker, string luthier, Barrie Kolstein. If you're new to The Hump, this is a series where I interview some of the world's most talented artists and musicians and find out why are they so amazing, how did it all happen, and ultimately what can we learn from their journey. Before I bring you today's amazing episode, I'd love to thank our sponsors, and first up we have the clothing company Jam's World. You guys, I absolutely love Jam's World. I'm wearing a Jam's World right now, of course, and the reason why I love it is because the fabric is made from 100% spun crushed rayon, and it keeps me cool and comfortable. They've been making clothing in Honolulu, Hawaii since 1964, and the artwork is so unique. It's screen printed right onto the fabric, and it looks like a piece of art. Go to jamsworld.com and use the promo code JAZZ15, and you'll get 15% off your entire online purchase. Next up, I'd like to thank Kolstein's String Shop. I absolutely love Kolstein's. They are doing amazing things for the bass community. They have 2 amazing locations in Long Island, New York, and a killer online store. Go to kolstein.com and use the promo code KD10 and you'll get 10% off your entire purchase. All right, that time has come to bring you our episode today, and like I said, I'm really thrilled to share with you this interview of Lynn Hannings. I will warn you, each of us, Lynn Hannings, Barrie Kolstein, and myself, seem to have pretty low blood pressure, so if you're feeling a little anxious, pop this episode on and you're gonna feel really good. This was definitely a fascinating episode for me, and I learned a ton because I hadn't given too much thought into the evolution of the bow at all, the bass bow. I kind of take it for granted. Of course, Lynn is an amazing, talented bow maker, but she takes us through all of the history and iterations of the bass bow to where it was in the Dragonetti and Kusevitsky time, all the way up to now, and how people are playing the bow and the different changes that have happened. Lynn is also a huge activist in the conservation of Pernambuco, and we talk all about that and how she spoke in front of the UN in Geneva. She's quite an extraordinary person, and it was so much fun to have Barrie Kolstein there talking about his experience working with the bow in Pernambuco. I know you're going to enjoy this episode, and you're definitely going to relax. So without further ado, here is Lynn Hannings and Barrie Kolstein. Well, my cat, maybe you can't see it, but she likes to chew right at me.
Oh, yeah.
This is just a Pernambuco wrapped bow, so it's nothing special, but still, it's an expensive cat toy.
A very expensive cat toy.
I fix them all the time, and Arnold Bone taught me how to fix those because he used to take dents out of gun handles. He was an avid hunter, and he taught me some tricks about how to get rid of those dings. So, Barrie, if you're nice to me, I'll share it with you.
Oh, thank you, Liz. You forget I'm dealing with that bow impaling on sides of instruments all the time.
Yes, you are.
And I'm sure you see like people, my mom, I mean, she plays bass, she'll like duct tape her bass, but I'm sure you see people like they try and fix their instruments and bows themselves, and it's just like, you should have come to me.
You know what, I just got in, Marv Topolsky, who was in the Metropolitan Opera, just passed away, and I have all his instruments and bows in the shop now. And one of them in particular was one that's attributed to a Santa Giuliana. It's a little tiny Italian bass, great bass, and it was his go-to bass, particularly as he got older, because it was so easy to play. But I remember when he brought that bow, when I brought that bass to the shop, that's before we even were in Baldwin. It was about a 4-year restoration because the bass came in and it literally had, it could have had 120 brass rivets in the ribs holding it together. And I had to take each one of those rivets out and plug them. And to this day, I look at that bass and I get bad feelings.
Oh. Well, I won't show you my mom's bass because there's duct tape, super glue, brown Sharpie.
Oh.
That's funny.
And what's the name of the party crasher behind you?
That's Cassie.
Okay. Good. All right. If Cassie, is not good, she'll turn into strings.
There you go.
I'm always threatening my cat. Well, cool, Lynn. It's so great to have you on The Hump. It's great to meet you too. I love how everyone's so active on social media now, so I feel like I know people. But how can you just briefly? We a lot of us know how the bass has evolved, like the instrument itself, but can you just kind of go through briefly how the bass bow has evolved through all, the iterations of bass playing.
Yeah, for sure. I'll start back in the early 1700s, because back then, if a bass bow was made, it was made on the model of a cello bow, or that would be the overhand hold, or the viol bow, and that would be the under. And they could have pike or hatchet heads. They could have fluting down the length of it. They really looked like viol bows, and the fingers were used for tightening the hair, and that lasted for a long time. They were very light in weight, and I think that it really didn't matter that they were light in weight. Bass players weren't asked to do very much back in those days. They were usually small venues, small concert halls, and so volume wasn't very important, and they weren't playing advanced technique either. It was pretty simple at that time. But when you got to around the 1750s, then there were more demands on them by composers and conductors, and they were playing in larger venues for larger audiences, more important music. And so those bows got heavier and shorter, so they started to evolve towards what we recognize as bows today. And that time, right around 1750, was an important time. Pernambuco was first starting to be used for bows, which was a huge deal. And screw and eyelet was created, was invented, so that tightening the hair became a whole lot easier.
That must have been huge.
Oh, I can only imagine how much they must have loved it at the time.
Yeah.
Because it's so much easier to do it that way.
I don't even understand. How would you have done it the other way? I can't really picture that.
You just jam your fingers up against the hair and push hard, and you get this inconsistent, it must have been terrible.
Yeah, you know what they actually had, they had inserted behind the hair, with the hair wrapped around the back of the frog. Very often you'd put a wedge behind there to tighten the hair if the hair got too loose, things of that nature, aside from lifting up with your pinky to tighten the hair as you were playing.
Wow. And sorry, not to backtrack, but like pre-1750s, I mean, you kind of mentioned the wood, but was it really particular? Did it really matter what kind of wood the bow was made out of, and the hair as well?
There were lots of other alternatives to Pernambuco that were used first, lots of other tropical hardwoods from South America or Central America. But, there's just nothing for playing. There's just nothing that has met the needs of the players in the way that Pernambuco has. It really very quickly became the wood of choice. And it was slow to come to bass bows. It was used for violin, viola, cello bows first. And then eventually, as bass players were considered real musicians, then they were allowed to have their share of the Pernambuco as well. But it's strong, and yet it's supple. It has a beautiful tone. It looks beautiful. It's a hard wood to beat. But there were other woods that were used first, and there are woods that are used today that are not Pernambuco. The other thing that happened in the 1750s was a ferrule that fit onto the frog, which stretched. Let me show you a ferrule. This is a ferrule right here, and it just stretched the hair out to the edges. So you had a wider band of hair, and it gave you more control and a nicer sound. So that got us up to almost to the 1800s, and that's when Dragonetti had such a tremendous influence. Barrie, do you want to talk about Dragonetti for a minute?
Well, I mean, again, the bows, or the synonymous bow with Dragonetti, was really dates back really to an offshoot of the gamba bows. I mean, I think, Katie, you have a couple of photos that I sent to you, didn't you?
I do. I've got it all ready here. Let's see.
Oh, you are good.
Let's see. See if I can do this right.
Yeah, that was the Dragonetti. As you can see, the hair went wrapped around the back of it, and very often if the hair loosened up, people would put wedges underneath behind there to tighten the hair, rather than rehairing the bow as often as they did. And, and again, your pinky would wrap underneath, or your fingers, pinky or third finger or fourth finger would wrap underneath and pull up on the hair as you were playing. But this was really an offshoot of the gamba bows. And then if you go further with the photos, there's actually more photos of that, but the head on that. But Dragonetti brought to the table a newfound level of playing performance, and to the point that Beethoven, I believe it was Beethoven, was taken with him and actually started writing, more intensive works for the bass. I mean, it's one of the reasons why at that point, a lot of the orchestras were still to the point where the cello was the lowest instrument in the orchestra. The bass was not incorporated yet. And when the bass got incorporated into the orchestra, that's where the term double bass came, because it basically, in most of these old symphonies, they had to orchestrate. And what did they do? They just copied the cello part for the bass, which created an issue because, the cello was tuned in fifths, went down to a low C, even though the bass was an octave lower. And at that time, there were 3-string tuning. The tuning was, there was some forms of tuning, but it was really most of the higher level players had their secret of tuning. They basically tuned the instruments and didn't let people know how they were tuning it. And they tuned it to different pitches at that point. But, that incorporated or brought forth the need for 5-string basses, which incorporated a 5th string or a C string, or low C string extensions, which came in the latter part of, or I should say the early part of the 20th century. Now, Lynn, let me ask you a question. Do you feel that Tort was, who was considered the father of the modern bow? Do you feel he was very influential in some of the design of the bass bow as well?
Yeah, I really do. I've seen a bow made by him, a French model, and it is just, if you went to a photocopy, if you did a drawing of a violin bow and you went to a photocopier machine and blew it up, this is exactly what this bow would look like. It was so early and it was so far beyond what anybody else was doing. He was really innovative. And I think he was a watchmaker before he was a bow maker. And so he was mechanically inclined, and he really worked with the musicians to make these bows as musician friendly as they could be. I think he just did fantastic work.
Amazing work. He was very innovative also.
Incredible.
I mean, I think when you're talking about Bottesini, so many people were influenced by Dragonetti, that most of the players at that point were playing the overhanded or the butler or the German style bow, which was the forerunner of the modern German bow. Bottesini, I think, was one of the first prominent players that actually switched over and started playing the overhand bow or the French bow style.
A lot of the change in the camber, where it went from arched way over to beginning to go down as we would recognize it today, was happening during Dragonetti's lifetime. He was in London, and then there was this big group of makers and who were responding to the players. And so over the course of his career, that camber went down and down and down and down. It got much closer to the string, and I think they were finding greater control as they did that. So that was a very popular thing. And so it evolved not just in Germany, but Germany and England as well.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of people don't know that Dragonetti was very influential with makers. I mean, particularly if you talk about one of the leading or the foremost English maker, Vincenzo Panormo, who came from I believe the same town as Bottesini came. And Panormo worked his way from there into France, and then eventually to Scotland, and then to London. But Bottesini, or rather Dragonetti, followed him, and actually he was influential in placing almost all of Panormo's instruments. Anything that was made went into Dragonetti's hands, and in fact, Panormo had 2 sons. He had George Louis Panormo and he had Joseph Panormo. And when Vincenzo died, Dragonetti became the executive of his estate and actually settled his estate rather than his sons. So that's how influential he was with the London makers.
Wow. I guess I'll ask both of you this question, but do you think the overhand French style just came from just being influenced by cello, or the style of music, just the different ease of being able to play more complex music?
I think which I don't necessarily, I happen to be a German bow player. I was a Zimmerman student, and and that's how I was brought up. But I mean, the truth of the matter is, the best way I can put it to you is there one bow better than the other? No. I mean, the Zimmerman used to say to me as a student, I'm sure he said it to other students, that if you could hold the bow backwards and stand on your head and play it properly, that's good. There's no problem with that. And it's the same thing with the bows. But I think there's that French bow was known to be more of an articulate bow. It meshed more with the orchestra because all the other instruments were playing these overhand bows, French style bows. So I don't know. What is your opinion on that, Lynn?
Well, I don't know. I think the French style that we call French today, the overhand style, seemed to be more popular, growing in popularity in Italy and then into France. I don't know whether it was considered a soloistic decision versus an orchestral decision. I don't know. We'll have to ask Galen, or maybe David Hayes would have answers for us on that sort of stuff. I think that they were evolving, interestingly. They were really happening about the same time, where the English and the Germans were just going full speed ahead with their German bow, and the French were going full speed ahead with their French bow. So it was interesting to see that the two could coexist.
And the cool thing now is that there's, so many virtuosic bass players out there. Whether they play French or German, the way they hold it is so different. They might be playing French but doing underhand because of whatever sound they want to get, or articulation. Or some people, they'll play French but they'll just kind of grab it to get what they want. And I love it. I find it so fascinating.
I mean, there was actually a bow made that was called the Belgian style bow that actually you could hold French or German. It looked like a French bow, but it was a higher frog. And the opening in the throat was wide enough that you get, your hands in like a German bow. I actually try to find one of them. I just didn't have one in the shop. They're not that common.
I grew up, I play French. That's just how I grew up, just like you, Barrie. But I was teaching a lesson the other day and I grabbed someone's German bow. My mom plays German too. And I was like, oh, I kind of like this. This is, you can really put your whole body into it. I'm not converted yet, but it was fun.
I've seen a number of plays. I mean, I think back in the jazz world, Percy was a French bow his entire life until he got older. And then he basically went to German bow because you're utilizing your natural arm weight, as far as that goes. There's some drawbacks, negatives of each bow, as far as things that you have to compensate for. But one bow isn't any better. It's the player. It's the player behind it.
Oh, that's a great answer. That's a diplomatic answer. I just wanted to share the photo of the transitional bow that you were kind of mentioning as well, Lynn. Yeah, so you can see like the strings, the hair's getting closer. Everything's kind of getting closer to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Plus the camber. At that point, there was a reverse camber going on, or the proper camber.
Yeah, they changed that, and so by the 1800s, the camber and I would say the look of the bow is very much like what we would see today. But because basses were never standardized. Basses are basses, and they're all different. Every single one of them is different as far as I can tell. So the bows also varied. They varied in weight and length and balance and the materials that were used. But you can see that both the overhand and the underhand style both started to come down with the camber. This particular one has a camber that comes down a little bit forward of center of the playing length. The overhand model has the bottom of the camber right in the middle of the playing length. So there's just a very subtle difference in that camber, but it was established back then, and it really, in many ways, it hasn't changed since then.
Well, maybe this will come into the next question. When did the art of making bows come into the United States? Because I know it's, of course, very traditional in Europe.
Well, I think some of that, it was definitely influenced by makers coming from Europe. I mean, you had makers such as Vitali that came to New York. You had Ouchard, who actually came to New York. Ouchard came to work with Emil Herman's shop and was not happy with the shop and ended up at the Wurlitz's shop. So, I mean, there was a transition, but and there were people, I mean, to be honest with you, my dad was one. But he was more or less self-taught as far as bow making goes. So, and Bill Salchow also. I mean, but Bill, I believe, was trained in Europe, wasn't he, Lynn?
Yeah, he was. He was a student. He was a cellist at Juilliard, and he took a part-time job working as a secretary for Wurlitzers. And when he showed some curiosity and some interest in bows, they quickly got him over to France. And so a lot of people were still being trained in Europe and then brought over to the shops. But by the next generation, those people that were living in New York or Philadelphia or wherever the big shop might be, were training, were doing their apprenticeships there. So that there was then a U.S. group.
Like maybe by the 50s or 40s or so?
Yeah.
40s, 50s.
Yeah.
I mean, you had
World War II in there that caused some slowdown in all of that. But Bill went to France immediately after World War II when he got back from his duty there in Europe. So by, I think, 1955, he had gotten his training and was back in New York with a shop of his own.
I know that the Wurlitz's shop also had a very close affiliation with the Hill shop. And so virtually, you know, a good portion of the Hill bows came to New York through the Wurlitz's shop. So that was a way also of bringing not necessarily bows that were made in the U.S., but bringing that tie in.
And maybe you don't know the answer to this question, but was it primarily like this craft on the East Coast, or do you know, was this happening on the West Coast as well, or, you know, other parts in the United States?
That's a good question. I mean,
New Yorkers, New York is the center of the universe, isn't it, Barrie?
Yeah, and I was particularly in those days, it was the center of the universe. I mean, your entire recording industry was in New York.
Yeah.
Everything that was going on. Eventually, it all spread it down south. It went out to the West Coast, and makers went out. I'm trying to think of the Frank
Passa.
Passa, that's it. Yep. Frank Passa was being groomed at the Wurlitz's shop as a bow maker. In fact, that's how my dad indirectly got, you know, the Wurlitzer collection of wood, because he chose, Wurlitzer felt that he wasn't going to be a full-fledged bow maker, you know, produce a great number of bows. But I've seen a number of it. I've seen one or two of his bows, and they were nice work. And he ended out on the West Coast.
And Hans Weissar ended out there as well. Yep. And the Bennings are out there.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, right now you have your share of very fine makers out on the West Coast.
Oh, you know, yeah. I wasn't pushing for the West Coast, but I was just curious.
No, but back in the 40s or 50s, as Lynn said, not that I'm saying that New York is the center of the world, but the music world at least, but it truly was at that point.
Oh yeah,
it was for me. It had Fred Zimmerman and Oren O'Brien, so it had to be the center of the universe.
Doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, that's incredible. So, let me.
If I could just add one more thing, it used to be that people were trained in shops because there were these big shops, and they would have walls of bench space and people who could train, people who could do apprenticeships there. But that started to break up, where people were running smaller shops. Wurlitzer's shop had, I don't know, 10 or 12 people working in it, and there came a time when that just disbanded.
Yep.
And so then there were 10 or 12 little shops. And so that became a real problem for education in this country. And Carl Roy was the man's name who started the Violin Institute at the University of New Hampshire. And it was the first training school anywhere in the United States. That was about 50 years ago now. And he came over, he was the head of the violin making school in Mittenwald, Germany, and he wanted to summer in New Hampshire. So he found the perfect solution and he started this school. Now there are lots of classes and training sessions all over the place, but it's not, I mean, you take many, many weeks in order to get good. You can't just take a week's class and call yourself an expert at anything.
I mean, there's a number of schools that exist, and I would say the United States has some of the best schools that exist in the world right now, whether it be North Bennett, whether it be the Prius School, the Chicago School of Violin Making. Ed Campbell had one, Chimney. I don't know if that's still around, but I'm not sure how much they really devoted time to bow making. I think it was more instrument making.
Yes, it's cool that it's still, I mean, I it's kind of like with any musical profession, right? You can go to school and learn, but you're not going to, the best way to learn is by underneath somebody, by apprenticeship. And I like that's how the bow making started here, was just, oh, you're in the shop and you show interest. Okay, we're going to take you to Europe. Kind of just like with Manny at Kolstein's. I love that you can come in with zero knowledge and just work your way up. I love that doesn't exist in so many professions, and it's very cool.
It's not easy anymore. I mean, you know what, when Wurlitzers were around, particularly for violin or bow identification, I mean, some of the best, it was constant flow of great bows that the people in Wurlitzers could study and view. I remember Dario Diatilli telling me about, you know, his experiences and my dad's experience. My dad was the head bow restorer for Wurlitzers, but not in Wurlitzers. He had a shop up on 55th and 6th Avenue, but away from Wurlitzers. But they consigned him all the work, you know, as far as the duplication of frogs and things of that nature, and restoration of bows. But Dario used to say that it was an era that doesn't exist anymore. You know, you were total immersion into these great instruments, great bows, and being able to discuss it with your colleagues at the same time. That's how you learn.
Totally.
Sure.
I wanted to bring up some photos of the post-Dragonetti bow.
Okay. Yeah, that's still where the frog is affixed. It's not, even though there's a ring there, that's, I think it was more of a repair to the stick or whatever, but this frog was affixed. You couldn't tighten it. You're still pulling up underneath and, you know, as far as tightening the hair. But definitely the camber is going in the more current direction.
Yeah.
And the head shape is looking more and more like what we would recognize today too.
Absolutely. As is the frog. You know, frog was starting to come down.
I'm just imagining having to play on one of these because that's all you can play on.
They were big bows.
Yeah, here's another, just a close-up of the head of it.
I think that's 19th century dust also that's on that.
Yeah. I was about to say, too, you could probably knock somebody out with one of these.
Yeah, but Lynn was right. They weren't too excessively heavy because a lot of this wood was, it could have been, you know, alternative woods like Brazil wood. I've even seen some of them made out of basswood, you know. So, I mean, it was a pretty light density wood as opposed to Pernambuco. And I think, Lynn, you would attest to it, that probably one of the reasons why Pernambuco didn't fall into favor with bass bows right away is that it's a very treacherous wood. You know, it's not an easy wood to camber. It's not an easy wood to work with, and particularly with the dimensions.
Very, very dense. It doesn't float. That's one of the ways we can determine whether or not it's Pernambuco. You can toss it in water, and if it sinks, it's Pernambuco. So it is very dense, and that makes it hard to bend.
Wow. I think that's my slideshow. Although this one, oh, here, this one just looks scary. Yeah.
That has to be a Viome bow because it's got the Viome slot on it.
Yeah. It almost looks like basswood, doesn't it? Or
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it is basswood.
beechwood or something like
Yeah,
that.
beefwood also could be.
Yeah.
Well, continuing, in the history of bows, and it's just kind of like how anything happens, people get better and better. Food's getting better. I love to eat. But so musicians are getting better, bass players are getting better. So are there still advancements to bows, bass bows, depending on musicians, whether it's something custom made? And then, I know everyone in my family plays an instrument, and my sister's viola bow was a few $1,000s. So what goes into the cost of these newer, maybe more custom made bows, or bows for high level players?
I would. You want me to start? You start, Barrie.
No, I was just going to say that, like instruments, we're dealing with functional art. So you're part of the price that you pay for whether it be an instrument or a bow is the pedigree of that bow and the maker's time and what that maker feels, whether that be a living maker or a maker that's passed on, and what the intrinsic value has developed on that, or what the current maker feels his work is worth. As far as Pernambuco is not inexpensive today, and when it's not a readily accessible wood. Any longer because of which Lynn will go in later, as far as the restrictions on cutting the wood and milling it. But the fact is that the wood itself has cost. The ebony has cost. There's a tremendous amount of time as far as the intrinsic work of making a bow, as far as the silver work, the jewelry work that goes into it, and then the net worth of the brilliance of the maker who's made that bow and how good it comes out.
I think, though, that we have a great refinement in the artistry. People have just gotten so precise. The work is so beautiful. Just as you hear when people are playing bass solos these days, and they're so lyrical and they're so in tune. Every note is in tune. Well, with bow making, I think we had the opportunity to study those old French and German bows, and they were great then when they were made, and they're still great today. That's the really remarkable thing about those antique bows. They were made anywhere from 1700 to, I'll go right up to 1950, because that would be right after Sartori's death. Well, those bows are still great, and they're still working for musicians today, even though musicians are playing with a different kind of technique than ever before, more technique than ever before. Those bows hold up over the course of time. So the responsibility, I think, of the bow maker is to really study those bows of the past and just revere that work. And I do think that people who are players first, before they come to bow making, have a heads up on people who are just trying to figure out, is this just about the dimensions of the wood, or is it just about the density of the wood? There's a language and there's a feel that musicians know. When you pick up a bow, what the weight and balance feel like. How to describe that to another person. So I think that players like Barrie, like myself, possibly have an inner track where we just have a closer relationship to the bows. And I have a tough time with students who don't have that, who come to bow making from engineering or come to it from some other skill. If they come as musicians, they often struggle with the tools, getting the tools sharp, making things with their hands isn't something that they've done before. So maybe it may look pretty terrible, but when you tell them to graduate the stick, they can do that by feel. And that's a really interesting and exciting thing to be part of. They can make beautiful sounding bows that don't look very pretty.
I think it's
the goal is to do both. The goal is to have them play beautifully and look beautiful at the same time.
I think it's such an important factor, whether it be instrument making or bow making, that you are a player, because you have to understand what the end user of that bow is requiring, what they're looking for. I too have a difficult situation with makers, more so than even bow makers, because I come in contact with them more often than bow makers. But I mean, the fact is that I do have issues with instrument makers, and that don't play an instrument, and they create an instrument, and then they have to hand it off to someone else to evaluate it. I mean, you should be your worst critic.
Yeah.
Or to set it up properly. You know how important it is. The setup is just so critically important.
That too. Yeah.
And that's something that players can do, I think, better than people who are not players, who are makers but not players.
I think it's an essential part. I know that when I trained with my father, part of my training, and I trained with him as a bow maker and an instrument maker, because he was both. But he insisted that I have a background, that I learn the instrument and become a player. Because he said, you're not going to have the full benefit of your own work unless you understand and you play the instrument.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, very wise.
Imagine a chef not eating their food, or not ever tasting, making something. I never have tasted their ingredients before and then presenting it.
No.
It'd be frightening. Yeah. And you brought up a great point, Lynn. The level of playing has gotten, it's the highest it's ever been. And why wouldn't bow making be the same? And it seems like, or instrument making, and it seems like one of those things, if you go into it seriously, you do it because you love it, right? And you want to attain a certain level of perfection. So I totally get what you're saying. It really compares with the musicianship right now.
For sure.
And with, modern bow making, are there any new materials being used?
Well, we have challenges as new bow makers. When those antique, not antique makers of antique bows, didn't have any restrictions on any of the materials they were using. And so they just used whatever they wanted. They could put ivory frogs on there. They could use tortoiseshell for their frogs. They could use whalebone wraps. They could use Pernambuco for even inexpensive factory bows. They could use the very finest wood for factory bows that were selling for just pennies. They could do the same with ebony. And so makers today have greater restrictions on them, and need to know all of those restrictions and abide by them, because they're all legitimate. They're all legitimate concerns, environmental concerns. And so makers today are more likely to experiment with alternative woods. And there are, I would say, Ipe and Brazilian bloodwood are two of the big, most successful alternatives to Pernambuco. And plastic, replacing the whalebone wrap. There's a composite, there's a plastic that's used for tips now that has grain going in both directions. So it's super strong and it's still white, looks just like a tip, feels just like a tip. But for international travel, it's legal, and there's no possibility that you're going to have your bow confiscated by somebody. So there are lots of those materials, and a shout out to the Glasser family, who now 3 generations ago were thinking about non-wood bows, alternatives to wooden bows, and came up with, just in the experimentation stage, those brown fiberglass bows that people don't like very much. However, they were the start of something really important. And I just admire the family so much for sticking with it, and developing greater and greater and greater connections to the musicians, coming up with now braided carbon fiber bows that are well balanced. They sound good. I wouldn't want it to be my #1 bow, because I don't, I think there are limitations to the sound of carbon fiber. But if I were a student, or if I was a teacher with an orchestra full of kids, and I couldn't afford a budget to replace those bows regularly or have them rehaired regularly, I would want to be able to use those, or as a second bow. I have to send my bow off for rehair. What am I going to use? You want to have a second bow that plays well. Or if you're playing outdoor concerts or weddings, you want to have something that's going to be more durable, perhaps, than the wooden bow that you would normally use in the concert hall. So all of those materials, I think, have given us opportunities to abide by those rules and stick with it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I agree with you. Andrew Glasser is a brilliant man, and he's done some wonderful things, total dedication, and his whole family has, and carbon fiber is an answer. It's not, I agree with you, it's not my first choice, and it's not even a bow that we normally stock within the store, but or our shop, but it is a viable option that exists out there, particularly as a secondary bow.
If you think of bow making or bows and you make a triangle with your hands, you're going to have antique bows, a little tiny part of the top of that triangle in terms of the number of bows on this planet. And then you're going to have handmade bows, modern bows down below it, 1950 to the present. And then you've got all this student stuff down below it. You've got all the factory bows that are made out of wood, and factory just means somebody makes the frog, somebody makes the stick, somebody else makes the button. It's an assembly line process. And that's maybe happening Germany, France. Now bow making is a big business in Brazil and China, certainly. So there are these vast numbers of these these factory bows. And when it comes to factory bows, I don't know if all the wood is legally harvested, and I would give serious thought to buying carbon fiber.
Well,
if you can't afford a really good bow.
Well, and you can get a blue carbon fiber bow.
That's right.
Or paint your Pernambuco blue, but I don't think so. But on that same subject, Lynn, I know you work with the International Pernambuco Conservation Initiative. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, that was quite an adventure. It still is an adventure because it's so different than what bow makers have done. In 2003, we hand making bow makers, and it's just a small number of us around the world, but we were notified that there was a move in Brazil to list Pernambuco on the United Nations CITES restrictions list. That meant that they were worried that this wood was going to become endangered, that it was going to go away, as rosewood did. So they already knew how bad things could get because they just watched it happen to their rosewood, and they didn't want it to happen to Pernambuco as well. So those of us who are in this business don't go to Brazil and harvest trees by ourselves. You go down to the docks in Brooklyn and you go to William Marshall and you buy a couple of boards, and that's as close as you get to the environment in Brazil. But we had to do a better job than that, because we realized at that point in time that there was tremendous deforestation, not just from bow making. Bow making was a small part of that, from agricultural use of the land in the North Atlantic rainforest in Brazil. It's the only place on the planet where this wood grows. Multinational paper companies were coming in, and they were making a mess of things and planting their wood for harvest everywhere. They were also destroying the soil by using Agent Orange as a defoliant to plant their eucalyptus. There was tremendous population growth along the coast. So the Atlantic rainforest was a mess, and Pernambuco was really endangered at that time. And so it was because we knew about it suddenly, and because we realized that we were going to lose the future of classical music if we didn't do something. I have enough wood for my life. I'm not worried about me. But when I think about the future of music performance, I knew that we needed to do something. So we started this organization. It needed scientific backing in order to meet the criteria of this important work that the United Nations was doing. And so we worked with scientists from the New York Botanical Garden and the Rio de Janeiro Botanical Gardens, with the Department of Agriculture in Brazil, and came up with a couple of very good scientific programs to do the research that was required and the planting that was required. We've planted hundreds of thousands of seedlings down there. So I'm very proud of our work. And I must say that I was a nervous wreck, but I went to The Hague and I represented this program to the United Nations, to all 213 countries or whatever it was.
What year was that?
I don't remember what year it was. It was Conference of the Parties. I'll have to check it out.
Okay.
I have a little flag in my shop to remind me, but I would say 10 years ago, maybe, something like that. And we were at a point where Pernambuco was going to get an Appendix 1 listing or an Appendix 2 listing. Appendix 1 would mean that musicians would not be able to travel internationally with any Pernambuco bow. And that seemed counterproductive because we needed musicians to support our program, to plant trees, to try to solve this problem. The best that we could hope for was an Appendix 2 listing, which meant musicians could travel with finished bows, but that the raw materials could no longer be transported internationally without a lot of paperwork to go along with it and documentation that it was legally harvested. So I made my presentation and I said a short prayer and I sat there and waited, and two people spoke up. One was the representative from Germany, and he said, this is the first time in history when the users of a resource are the ones driving the engine of conservation. And he mentioned teak and he mentioned rosewood, and he just, there was a great compliment because he saw our sincerity and he saw the positive effects of the program. Secondly was the man from Brazil who stood up and he said he before had wanted to shut it down completely. Stop using Pernambuco. It's our wood. You don't have the right to steal it, to use it. He stood up and he said, I look forward to the day when Pernambuco flourishes on concert halls around the world and in the forest in Brazil. And so we suddenly realized that we were all in this together, that the conservationists weren't the enemies, the United Nations restrictions weren't meant to hurt us. We were all in this together for the good of the species. And so it's evolved now. We continue to plant, we continue to do scientific research, we continue to raise funds to pay for all of that. And now there's another group, the Alliance, which is a group that is supporting Pernambuco conservation, but has expanded their reach to also do the same for ebony, which is huge. They're doing research and reforestation in Mauritius. And also, amazing, a management plan for maple. Where I sit, I look out the window and I see maple trees everywhere, and I think, maple can't be endangered. This is ridiculous. But the maple that's used for bridges, the maple that's used for backs and ribs is very different species than what I see out here. And what a smart move this is to come up with a management plan so that we can be treating those trees sustainably now before they're in the same treacherous position that Pernambuco and ebony are. So I think it shows that we've learned a few lessons along the way as an industry, and I hope that we continue to get good works done. It's challenging, but it's very, very interesting and very important.
Bravo, Lynn.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Such an amazing job, and I actually have a personal note of thank you to you and George, because if it wasn't for you reaching out to me in 2006 and telling me about this, I have that huge collection of Pernambuco that came from the Wurlitz's shop. You were kind enough to let me know what I needed to do and how to do it, and to document the wood so it's legal to own that wood, legal to use it, legal to put it into the hands of other great makers.
Yeah, the danger there was that if If Barrie hadn't done that paperwork at that time, and suddenly we found ourselves with an Appendix 1 listing, that would be worthless. It would never be able to make a bow out of that wood, and it's precious. It's such a precious commodity. It's such valuable wood that I wanted to be certain that it was protected, and good that you did it.
Well, it's because of you.
I did too.
Thank you.
Well, I love too that you're like, this isn't for me. You're like, I've got wood, but it's for the future of the music, which is, it's such a wide reach, it's not just one person or one orchestra. It's like the whole world of music.
I remember specifically making a trip to Washington and and New York as well, and talking to people in the Symphony League and saying, do you have any idea how this will impact your travel, your lives as traveling musicians?
Did people just write you off when you were kind of trying to get this out there?
They thought we were overreacting, I think. They didn't really understand it, but we weren't overreacting at all. We were just looking at the scientific facts, and the deforestation there is undeniable. It's extraordinary. So the program does a few things that I think are just great. One is that it uses wood. It works with about 20,000 farmers who use Pernambuco trees as shade for cash crops, because in the past in Brazil, the only value a tree had was when it was cut down. And so all of a sudden now the tree has standing value, and maybe it can be selectively harvested in the future to give some good money 30 years, 40 years down the line. It could give some good money to the farmers' sons or daughters.
It's an asset.
It's an asset, exactly. But up until then, trees were just meant for cutting, and that's all there was to it. And so it's been great. And also our nurseries take people who were out there cutting trees and puts them in good jobs planting.
That's so cool. I'm sure there's a website that everyone can go to learn about this.
Yes, IPCIUSA.
Cool.
Is the website.
How do you store old, like Pernambuco wood? Does it have to be stored in a special way?
What do you do, Barrie?
Well, we keep, we layer it. So we keep an air flow going between each layer of the wood. You want to obviously keep it away from water, which is because Pernambuco, a lot of people don't know that it's an ancient wood. And in Egyptian times, they used it to stain clothing. Maybe they still do, I don't know. But it gives off a distinctive color when it gets wet, and that's not a good thing. So we generally will make certain, that the wood is kept on higher racks, and we keep, allow it, like we treat it the same way I treat with my instrument wood. I air dry the wood, so we usually put a layer of Pernambuco, and then we'll put a layer of rods underneath to lift the wood up away from the next planks. So there's a little bit of an airflow going underneath it. But the truth is the Pernambuco, the Wurlitzer collection I have, was acquired by my dad from Rembrandt Wurlitzer in 1950. And that wood was brought over by Emile Louchard in the 40s. And probably that wood was probably 20 or 30 years old at that point. So we're talking about well-seasoned wood at this point. I mean, Lynn, you've worked with the wood, it's, I've given you some of it, and it's pretty dense. It's good working wood.
It is indeed. It's wonderful. And I do about the same thing. I don't have as much wood, but just a little bit of space in between. So I keep it at a normal, I have it in my house, so it stays at a normal temperature. And I think I probably rotate it once every couple of years or something. I'll just go flip all the boards over. I don't know if that's necessary or not, but it was taught to me, so I decided to do it just in case.
You're better than I am. Too much wood to flip all the boards.
This is probably a different discussion, but how did people even figure out to use Pernambuco? Was it, I know it grows, in Brazil, but why?
Yeah, it grows in Brazil, and it was harvested. even Marco Polo talks about harvesting red hardwood. That was a big thing. It was used in the dye business.
Yep.
Pernambuco is a purple dye. It's used in fabrics. It was very popular in France because of all their tapestries and all of the things that they do. So the legend is that it just arrived on the docks in Paris, and somebody picked it up and tried to make a bow with it, and it was fantastic. And then about 1840, aniline dyes came along, and so there was no longer that same need for it. But since way back in the 1500s, it was being harvested at great amounts, just huge amounts. Even the president in 1540, the president of Portugal was quoted as saying something like, "Do you really think we should be cutting it this fast?" Those weren't his exact words, but even back in 1540, he was starting to be concerned at the volume of wood that was being pulled out and brought to Europe. So it had been around at the ports for many, many generations before bowmakers tried it.
Fascinating. And now jumping up to current times, how should people be taking care of their bows today? Like what are the definite do's and what are the definite don'ts, the no-nos?
I mean, I'm a firm believer that, if you have a bow, if it's forget about the intrinsic value of the bow, but if it's a bow that has value to you, it should fall into the hands of a reputable repair person, luthier, to do the work on it. I don't find, aside, I think as far as the use of the bow, even though I'm a rosin maker, I think rosin should be used in limited amounts. You should never over rosin the hair, because no matter how good the rosin is, whether it be mine or some of my competitors, you don't want to build up too much rosin on the hair. And so that's the maintenance. I would say, as with an instrument, you get done using the bow, wipe it down, as far as the stick goes, so you don't get an abundance of rosin building up on the stick, depending upon the finish. If it's a varnish type or a polished or rubbed on finish, rosin has a compatibility with varnish. It's made out of the same components, and same thing with the instrument. If you allow rosin dust to sit long enough, it'll embed into the finish of a bow. It'll embed into the finish of an instrument. So if you take literally 10 seconds to wipe your bow down, wipe your instrument down after use, you won't have that issue. As far as maintenance goes, when it comes into our shop, we do a general overchecking with the bow. When a bow comes in, it'll come in maybe just for a rehairing, but we'll check the bushings. We'll make sure the screw isn't wobbling around there, the eyelet is in good condition, the frog is in good condition, tip is in good condition, things of that nature. And then we'll, advise the owner of the bow accordingly what we feel should be done with it. But that's basically it. I mean, probably the biggest no on a bow is don't drop it. So.
Don't drop it, don't hit it.
And that leads me to the next thing that I wanted to say, and that's to make sure that you have it insured properly.
Yes.
I had a terrible experience with my bass, not my bow, luckily, but with my bass a couple of years ago, just before the pandemic struck and shut our orchestra down. I've been a member of the Portland Symphony for many, many years, and I was at rehearsal, and it just blew up. It made this incredible bang that sounded like a gunshot going off, and people were ducking in front of me. It was that scary. And then when I looked, the back had cracked open, but not cracked on the center seam. That would have been nice, but it didn't crack on the center seam. It cracked on raw wood off to the side of the center seam, and the bass bars sprung loose, and a million things happened with the impact, with the concussion of that. And so I brought it down to Barrie immediately. Barrie got it better than ever. It sounds wonderful. But you know what? I wouldn't have been able to afford that restoration because my income had just vanished from Symphony. I could not have afforded that cost of that restoration. if I didn't have an insurance company, a qualified insurance company that just took a letter from Barrie and went and wrote a check. And I just can't say enough. I've been paying $300 a year for my entire 50 years of career.
That's
thinking,
nothing.
why am I wasting this money? I don't need to do this. I don't need this insurance. But you know what you do? Because when that time comes, when something breaks, you need your insurance.
Yeah,
so don't do dumb things. Don't do dumb things like leave your bow on the music stand. I don't like people putting their bow under the string, where they catch it under the string. I just restored a German bow recently that snapped off right in the middle of the frog because somebody was forcing so hard to get under the string. So you can avoid your insurance company by being more careful and not doing those sorts of things. And maybe keeping the bow in a bow case when you're not using it.
Excellent. Yeah,
I think cats.
For cats. Right.
I believe it.
No, definitely. I've seen too many situations where people, where they take a break and they put the bow on the bow stand, and then the day after they're in my shop saying the head broke, and they're saying, but I didn't drop the bow. But what they don't know is someone maybe passed by that stand, knocked the bow off, picked it up, and even if they're honest, they looked at it and said, "Oh, thank God nothing happened to this." They put it on, but meanwhile, there was a hairline split in the bow, and tightening the bow, the head just split on it, and it broke the stick. So I mean, yeah, that's definitely a no-no. I don't like bows under the string. I never followed quite the logic of that myself.
If your bridge height is correct and your string height is correct, there isn't much room in there for a bow.
You are wedging it.
Forcing it under hundreds of pounds of pressure. Crazy thing to do.
I don't know. Have you ever seen, Lynn? I've actually had frogs come in that have actually had string lines that cut into the worn into the side of the frog.
Yeah.
From people for all the years of going under the string.
Yep. But there's one thing about it that makes sense, that they needed both hands for carrying their basses. And I get that. That makes sense. They just probably thought that it was going to be awkward to hold it on one finger or two fingers, or that they were more at risk of dropping it. So when you get to be 50 years in the orchestra and you've got to carry a bow and an instrument and a stool and blah, 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 it starts to get problematic. It's a lot of stuff to carry around, but putting it under the string isn't the answer.
No,
take trips.
Bow quiver works.
Take trips.
Yeah, take trips and get a Kolstein bow quiver.
Okay. How much do I owe you for that?
Yeah.
I have one.
I do too, yeah. I love to, Lynn. Oh, I don't love it, but it's like, of course your bass had to explode in the orchestra, right? It couldn't do it in the privacy of your own home.
No, never. It was so weird. It just freaked me out completely. My heart was pounding.
Yeah. I'm a big believer in insurance of all kinds too. You add it up at the end of the day and you're just like, peace of mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, I won't keep you on for too much longer, but the last question, this has been so much fun, by the way. What's your advice, when people come into either your shops or for advice, like choosing a bow? How do you go about advising people with that?
All yours, Lynn. I'll answer after you, okay?
Okay. I'll start. We'll pass it back and forth. First thing I do is ask what they can afford. I mean, you don't want to start pulling out Ushards or Sartoris if what they can afford is $200 or under. So you have to really know your customer. And I think it's also important that you know something about where they are in their career, what they're using for an instrument. You have to really analyze how you can best help them find something. You can't just hand them bows and expect them to make good decisions. So price is always first. But then sound and feel are those things that they have to do themselves. That's the work they have to do. And I don't know if Barrie sent to you my bow comparison and evaluation sheet. I'll have
I don't
it
think
available
so, no.
for all
I
the
didn't. I'm
students.
sorry, Lynn.
That's all right. Don't worry about it. It's just a way of comparing 4 or 5 bows, because if you go into a shop or or you have having bows mailed to you and you've got them spread out on the table and you're trying one, putting it down, trying another and putting it down. It's really easy to get thoroughly overwhelmed and confused by it and not remember a thing about any of those bows. So this sheet, I think, is helpful for teachers and also helpful for students when they're just trying to keep their thoughts straight on bows. So I've got price range and sound and feel. You take it from here, Barrie.
You know what? I'm dealing with a double-edged sword because a lot of people come into my shop looking for an instrument or a bow. The truth of the matter is it's much easier to have the instrument aspect out of the way, you know, because you can take, which I've said many times, you can take 4 of Lynn Hannings' bows made out of the same plank of wood and play them on the same instrument, and they will draw a distinctively different sound. It's the one wonderful and beautiful part, one of the many beautiful parts about a great bow. It will draw a distinctive sound. So if you have the variable of your instrument out of the way, now you can concentrate on the bow. I find that, again, comparing people looking at instruments, looking at bows, I've had people come into my shop and I get a feel for what they're looking for as far as an instrument goes. And I'll show them a number of instruments. And once I get that feel for what they're looking for, there have been times that I've come back with them, brought back an instrument a second time and said, you shouldn't have passed over this instrument so quickly. Spend more time on it. Because an instrument, when you play on it, it's going to open up. It'll change. It'll get better as you play on it and open it up. A bow, in my opinion, is kind of inert in the fact that if it's a great playing stick, it's going to be a great playing stick. It might not be a great bow will be a great bow in everybody's hands. It might not be a bow that everybody wants to own, but it's still, no one's going to dispute that this isn't a good bow. The fact is that if you spend a half hour on a bow, one particular bow, you may acclimate yourself to that bow and compromise, to that bow, where an instrument will physically change. I don't believe, I've never really found that a bow will have that much of a change. So it's a little bit of simpler proposition, but matching it. So for me, it's better, I find it a difficult task where someone walks in, they're looking for an instrument and say, oh, by the way, I want to find a bow also. I'll basically say, find the instrument and then we'll deal with the bow.
Yeah.
I can imagine someone getting discouraged if you already have your instrument and then trying, maybe 5 bows, and then after a day or two going like, I think I need a new instrument. I just can't decide. Which, for you, Barrie, is great. Yeah.
Well, that should only happen all the time.
Yeah.
I have a bow story from when I was at New England Conservatory. I really needed a bow badly. I was studying with Gary Carr at the time, and he picked up my bow and just went, this is terrible. And so he was working with a man named Lawrence LeMay out in Wisconsin. And Lawrence was making nice short bows that were really well suited for Gary's style of playing down really close to the bridge. And so he brought in a couple of those bows. And to me, they felt identical, but I was just a kid. I didn't know the difference. And I went through my criteria of, can I afford it? How does it sound? How does it feel? Who made it? What conditions it in, that sort of stuff. I asked all those questions. And yes, it cost all of $275, which shows you how old I am. The sound was great. It pulled a pure, beautiful sound. The feel, it was a little weird to me. The weight was a little too far out towards the head, and I felt it immediately. It was bulky. I could play slowly and lyrically on the slow passages, but I was trying to work on a Bach suite. And when I was trying to do things fast and kind of perky and articulate, I couldn't make that thing move. It was just impossible for me. At any rate, I went on, I looked at the pedigree, I knew who it was made by, I knew it was in new condition. And the last criteria that I have is one that is so tricky for musicians: aesthetics, special looks coming from a special person. I snapped that bow up in 2 seconds because it was a special gift, a special part of my relationship with Gary. he wasn't trying to rip me off or do anything bad. He was just trying to help me find a bow that worked for me. And this is one that he felt would be great. However, I ended up with tendonitis, and I was out of playing for 6 months of my first year at the conservatory because the bow was not well suited for me. So if I'd gone back through my list, if I had that list then that I have now, and I got to feel, I would say, no, this is too tip heavy. I can't make it work. It doesn't work for me. Instead, I jumped right to, oh, this is coming from Geri and I've got to have it. So I still have it and I still can't play with it, but I love it. I have it and I love it. But there are people who will buy bows because they're gold mounted, or because they have fancy pearl, or because the wood is beautiful. They'll buy them for reasons that maybe are nice for collectors. If you're just a collector and you're not a player, you can use those kind of aesthetic criteria. But if you're a player, you got to be thinking about sound and feel.
Well, it goes back to the the term I used before, functional art. It is artistic work, but it has to function. It's as opposed to that beautiful painting behind you, Lynn, that looks wonderful on the wall. However, the bow has to be beautiful, or it should be beautiful, which all of your bows are, but it's got to function. It's also got to be a functional part of your career.
Yeah, I like too what you said, Lynn. It's like assess where you are in your career. I think younger people, it's like, I got to have the best. I've got to have the shiniest, newest thing or whatever. But is that going to serve you right now, where you are in your career? And maybe you get the less expensive bow because that's what you can afford. And then you get better and better and better. And then, before you know it, you can get the shinier, maybe more, whatever, established bow maker. But you got to be patient.
Yeah, absolutely.
Valid point.
Well, this was thoroughly enjoyable. I never knew talking about bows could be so much fun. It's very interesting to me because I grew up playing classical bass and using the bow, but now I'm focused on this is my sound, as my bow is my fingers, right? And that's also always constantly changing. So this is a very interesting comparison for me to talk about bows and sound and feel and everything. So thanks for letting me jump into your world.
Well, this has been wonderful, Katie. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I was honored to speak with both of you, Lynn and Barrie. This is so cool.